We are starting a new series today. We're starting a series called Fear Not. And you guys saw it on there. Fear Not is something that occurs in the Bible, like being told not to fear, or a command to us or to people in the Bible in a narrative. Being told to not be afraid, to not fear, 411 times. Now, there are other things that are important in Scripture, but realistically, when there are over 400 occurrences of being told to fear not, we want to make sure that that's something that we take inventory of our lives. Because here's the kind of hypothesis, the overarching idea that like your pastor wants to give you today, is that for a lot of us and the people we live with, we're living in hiding. And we've been living in hiding in parts of our lives for so long, we don't even realize it. I'm sure maybe you have a story of something that you have been not even realizing. I didn't even realize how much pain I was living in until I started doing these stretches, or until a doctor told me I can fix that. I always thought this was normal until I realized it. We sing a song in the church and at funerals called Amazing Grace. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I once was, say it, blind, but now I see. The whole idea of fear not is this idea that in Scripture, God is calling us out of darkness and into light. And Kurt read that a minute ago. We're going to go back to that in a second. But I just want to talk about fear for a second. And I was trying to think of when you're going to do a new series. So a couple of months ago when I started brainstorming about this series, I started thinking do I have any stories that would make people laugh or cry? Those are the two sides, or both. That's the win as a pastor. If you can get both in the same story. I don't have a lot of great stories, but here's the three that I kind of sketched down. And I'm just going to buzz through these because they're not laugh or cry. They're just, oh, you were scared. First one, I was 16 years old, so maybe my parents were more scared than me. But I was getting on an on-ramp. This was the 8. I grew up in San Diego, so we were getting on the 8, which is a 6 lanes going east. And it's one of those loops that you're coming up, so you can't quite see the interstate as you're going up there. And then right when you get up and you're about to get on the interstate, you're trying to get at speed. It was dark. It was nighttime, obviously, not a tunnel. And we were getting on the interstate, had a couple of my friends in there. We literally were coming back from the mall, right? And as I'm merging, I'm looking in my mirror, but I also look forward, and my headlights barely show that there is a stopped van in the merge lane in front of me. It's about 20 to 30 feet in front of me. I'm speeding up to get speed, so literally I have to swerve, which is really dangerous when you're going fast. Good news, we survived, all right? I swerved out of the way, and as we're driving, almost like nothing happened because we're fine, our hearts are racing. Because you got that feeling, it could have just been an accident. Our lives could have been completely changed there. And I would have had to tell my parents that I wrecked their minivan that I was driving. Which everyone should be really impressed that I was able to swerve so well in a minivan. Next story. I was 21 years old. I've been dating this really wonderful girl for 13 months. And we had been talking about getting married. We both had been. This isn't one of those stories where it was one-sided. We'd looked at rings, gone to the different mall that time. I didn't realize the mall was coming up in so many stories here. But I got that ring, and I put it in a drawer at my house, waiting for that perfect day. And every day I would go in and I would check to make sure the ring was still there. I would open the drawer, uncover it, open the box. I had an anxiousness I was carrying with me. The ring was just going to disappear, right? Or that it would be lost, or that it would be taken, that kind of thing. And then the day of, when I knew I was going to meet Becky and I was going to propose, it wasn't a huge surprise to her. It was just when is it going to happen, right? She had paid her dues, sent the check in. She was getting the proposal. She knew it was coming, just didn't know about the shipping date. And it was on its way. And the whole way, right, that drive felt like it took forever. And then when I was like, oh, good, it's taken forever, it would feel like it was going so fast. And I get there, and finally I pop the question. Everything's great, but still my heart's just beating, right? Because there's this fear, this weight I've been carrying. Like, there was relief. It was good, right? I want to be on the record there. But that was the time in my life that I was a different kind of afraid. The third story, I'll just say, this is the first day of grad school. And I am staying at my in-laws. This is where I proposed to Becky on their acreage there. And it's winter, and I'm driving to my very first day of grad school, right? It's supposed to be online except for this first day, and I've got to get there. I'm nervous. And they mentioned to me, hey, it's supposed to snow. But I didn't realize that it was actually a blizzard. Blizzards were something that was just on TV when I was a kid. I don't know where you guys all grew up, but I didn't really understand blizzards. That it would literally stop life. I drove for about an hour, 2 hours. I got across the Illinois-Indiana border, and it was as if Indiana said, we're just not going to plow the roads. And so as soon as I got over that border, it was like those end-of-the-world movies that are all about like climate change, end of the world. It was like you couldn't see that anybody had ever been there before other than the car's lights in front of you. And I started to get a little scared, but I was like, you know what, there's other cars out here. We're going 45 on the interstate. Totally fine. Then after a while, about an hour or two later, we haven't gone as far as I would have liked to in 2 hours. It's supposed to be like a 4-hour drive, but this one took me 4 days, right? And what I realized was that I had the seat heaters all the way up, both, just for the extra heat in the car. I had the heat and defrost all the way up, and all that it did, the windshield was pretty good, like in those spots. And then the only spots on the side were where like the heat would just kind of like hit it right there, like as big as my arm, right? I still felt pretty good. Like, you know what, other cars are on the road. I'm going to do this. What a great story that I can tell the church one day, that I can tell people one day. I was still, fear was there. But then I saw a Hummer, like a fully souped up Hummer, just spin off the road. Like it wasn't like a Bourne movie where like it exploded and spies ran out or whatever. But it just spun off the road, and that's when I went, well, I'm not going to say what I said. But that's the moment where I got on my phone and I went, Becky, like I'm not going to make it. Like, it's not if, it's when. And I ended up staying in a hotel for a day and a half. I met a lot of really nice truckers and figured out a way to eat and get to school, and things worked out. All three of the stories I survived. But fear has been a part of my life, and I'm sure there's stories that you've got that you can relate to the idea of fear. Because a lot of times what we've got when we just mention fear, or maybe you're in like a round circle group and it's an icebreaker, what's your greatest fear? What's a fear? We tend to say things a little bit like phobias, right? The Greek word for fear is phobia, and there are actually over 500 phobias that are like labeled and listed. And you guys might be familiar with some. One is arachnophobia, which is the fear of spiders. And then xanthophobia, which is the fear of the color yellow. And there are all across I don't know if this is the right word, but the spectrum of phobias and fears. And if we look up here, there's some of us that would say, okay, that spider right there, that's a wolf spider. I can understand why someone would be afraid of that. The right context, and it could be fear. There are some that if they have arachnophobia, just putting this picture up there could trigger you. The same way that some of us look at this idea that they literally have a word and almost I don't know if diagnosis is the right word, for having a fear of the color yellow. I put that up there a couple weeks ago, and I went, I don't know if I've triggered people when I wear my yellow backpack hiking, right? And we want to kind of mock this, but actually most fears are not grounded in reality. They're grounded in our perception of reality. And I don't know how much more to unpack that, but fear is based upon our perception of reality, not reality. Similar to if there was someone walking on the sidewalk or on a trail, and I'm walking this way, they may have no intention to hurt me. But if I perceive that they would want to hurt me, my body will start changing. My brain will start sending signals to my body to clench up, to prepare, be ready. My heart will start beating differently. That although fear begins with what we see, it ends with how we feel and what we do. And there's always a pattern to the way we fear. There's always a pattern. It starts with what we believe. What we believe leads to the triggers for that fear. And then what typically happens, and this isn't talked about a lot, and maybe there's different words we use for it, but the pattern goes, it goes from our belief to triggers to shame. I feel ashamed. I feel ashamed that I'm afraid of this. I feel ashamed for what this does to me, or what fear does to me. Then we react to our shame. If our shame is not brought into the light, we react to our shame, which then we go into hiding or isolation. It starts with what I believe. It leads to the triggers that are based upon our beliefs, which leads to shame if not dealt with, which is when we react to shame, and then we go into hiding. Now, beliefs are what we know, they're what we think, they're what we believe directly impacts what we're afraid of. If I believe a certain thing about a certain person or a certain place, it's going to lead to how I think. If I think church is boring, which I've been to church and been bored before, right? If I believe church is boring, then my brain will start sending signals to me to prepare to be bored. And then there are certain things that maybe we'll see in church that we've had happen to us before, or we've seen before, or maybe a movie or a documentary informed us about, that triggers us, that leads us to react, that leads us to feeling shame for being there. If the night before a school trip to the dinosaur museum, I showed my 9-year-old the movie Jurassic Park, how do you think that would go? Going to the dinosaur museum. It could have been Barney out front, but still there are going to be triggers that are going to lead to fear. If someone watches the movie Jaws, this happened, they are likely to do a little different activities when they go on vacation. They're not going to want to go in the water. And they're going to be really jumpy with every little thing sticking out of the water. Is it a shark fin, right? And you can even, I've seen people at the beach before, they would go near tourists and play the Jaws theme, like it was back then, it was like a boombox, you know? And it just made people laugh, usually. But if a boy is raised in a home with all sisters, that boy is likely to fear talking to women much differently than a boy raised in a home without any interaction with women. And you see that all the time. You can see the triggers that happen when a man tries to talk to women later in life, and it can happen vice versa. Triggers, though, are the third thing. What is a trigger? You can hear about it in the news. Oprah talks about it, I think, every day. I wouldn't really know. I just use her in this. But what we believe creates shields around us. And when those shields are penetrated or threatened, it triggers us to respond. Signals are sent to the brain, like I said before. Those signals are sent to the nervous system, and then they're sent to the entire body. And so when we are afraid, when I narrowly escaped an accident as a 16-year-old, it wasn't just my brain going, I missed a car, I am past it. You know, it wasn't quite like ChatGPT, it just happened. But my whole body was tingling, my heart was racing, because that's the signals that were sent to me saying you could die if you don't swerve out of the way and miss that. And also, if you swerved out and another car was merging at the same time and you missed that, things could happen. Now, Ryan, go ahead and put up that again, the order there. Because we're going to talk about how we all go through this. But there's actually a very humorous fictional character that most of us will be very familiar with, that goes through this right before us, that maybe we never noticed that before. And it is the arch nemesis of Peter Pan, lives in Wonderland, and is the captain of the Jolly Roger. You guys know who it is? Captain what? Captain Hook. What is Captain Hook's greatest fear? What triggers him? The tick-tock of a clock. Go ahead and put the picture up, because he is a spectacle of a man right there. Captain Hook. Now, Captain Hook is one of the greatest sword fighters in Neverland. Captain Hook has able-bodied adults fighting against kids is the most awkward part of the story, right? But he has adult pirates with swords, cannons. He should not be afraid of clocks, but in every depiction, in every storybook, in every play, he's afraid of a clock. His greatest trigger is when a little boy or someone has a pocket watch and he hears the clicking. It starts to trigger him. His whole body responds to the point where in most depictions he takes a mallet and smashes that tick-tock clock. Why? What is his belief? Well, at one point he lost his hand to a crocodile who has the tick-tock clock that never, I don't know who winds the clock or if it's the battery, solar powered, but that clock is still ticking. And so his beliefs lead to a trigger, which lead to shame, which leads to a reaction. And your reactions to shame and fear are one of three things. You fight, you fly, or you deal with it. You fight and stand up. You fly, you run away into isolation, or you deal with it. You figure out what is the root of this. Now, Captain Hook is a fictional depiction, and we can laugh about that. But I was blown away when I was looking at this at how that is right in front of us because he's ridiculous. But I think we can relate to just how ridiculous we can be and how we can respond to fear. A pastor that I follow, that I look up to, his name is Rick Warren. He said, fear is a self-imposed prison that will keep you from becoming what God intends you to be. You must move against it with the weapons of faith and love. Why do I follow Jesus? Because he leads and provides a way out of darkness and into light, of fear and of love. Before we dive deeper, let me pray. Can we do that? Can you just open your hands? God, we want to walk out of fear today. That we don't just want to read the Bible and check that off the list. We don't want to just laugh at some stories about Jared and fear. God, the greatest thing we can do today is be a group of people that when we leave here, that we go out into a world where it is encouraged to hide and live in freedom. Because freedom is so beautiful. And God, we are thankful you provide that. Amen. Well, Kurt read that story a minute ago, and that's the narrative portion of the first story in the Bible. This is right at Genesis 1 and 2, those chapters. That's when God's creating the world. He's making all the things that we enjoyed on the drive-in today, or we can see out our windows today. The things that God made, beautiful. It's important that we know that those are gifts provided. But there was one tree in the garden. God said, hey, this tree, this one tree, don't eat of it. And actually, we see in the text that God said, you can eat from all the other trees in the garden, but there's this one that's set apart. And the depictions, it looks like there's this clearing, and then this tree has this light on it, and that kind of thing. I don't know how often, Adam and Eve even saw the tree. But in this depiction, the serpent is there. And actually, we don't even know who the serpent is. The story doesn't tell it here. We find out later in the Bible, who the serpent is. But the serpent is talking. We got to get past that for this moment. And the serpent is saying the greatest lie. And that is, did God actually say that? And I think that's what typically happens before we sin. Before we make the biggest mistakes of our lives or the smallest mistakes, is we ask ourselves, or a voice inside our head says, is that actually true? Is it actually true that you shouldn't do that? Is it actually true that the consequences of taking this or doing this or not doing this is actually that? That usually it's not like we got up that day and said, I'm going to make a decision today that will impact the rest of my life. I'm going to do something today to hurt the people that I love. I'm going to do something today to cause division between me and someone else, especially people that care about me. Because typically the people that our mistakes hurt the most are not us. They're the people that care about us. Satan introduces shame by causing Eve to doubt herself, her community, and her God. And what ends up happening is what we realize is that when we're living in fear, when we're living in hiding, it cuts us off from community. That if we desire healthy relationships in our lives, God shows us really clearly we need to be living in freedom. Because I can spend time with people, I can spend hours with someone, but if they're living in fear of what I'm going to think of them, and they never fully are able to open up, and I'm never able to truly let them know who I am, when our relationship is tested by time, by distance, or by disagreement, we'll find that there was no relationship at all. A couple observations in this text, and I'll just buzz through these. First one, we see that pattern of fear to isolation is on display. That the same thing that happens to us, the same thing happens to Captain Hook, happened to them. We see this unhealthy fear pattern on display. Except there's one thing that's kind of added to it. And I don't think this ruins it at all. Show it. The one thing that's added is after beliefs, our beliefs can lead us to sin. Or in this case, oftentimes what happens is right here, you'll see sin will inform our beliefs. Do we have that next up on there? Right before beliefs, when we choose to go outside of the life that God created us for, when we choose to do things that hurt others, when we choose to do things that are the opposite of love, of joy, of peace, of patience, of kindness, and self-control, that informs our beliefs. Now you notice the thing that the snake said was, oh, he didn't say like, actually the fruit tastes great, or actually I've eaten it before. But what the snake decided to say was impact the beliefs of Eve. Did God actually say that? Is that actually going to happen? See, a lot of times what we think is going to happen is when we're tempted to do something outside of what is the greatest good, what's going to lead to the life that we desire, we think it's going to be a temptation to do something. But the greatest temptations, the ones that get us off, are the ones that are tempting us to believe something different. Because what we believe, our beliefs inform what we do. Second observation is this. Being found is the last thing we want when we're afraid. Did you notice? Now we have to assume, and there are verses that inform this, but we have to assume that Adam and Eve had walked with God before. They'd been in God's presence before. It wasn't like, oh, God's coming. We've never been around him before. Like, this was something that occurs all the time. But for some reason, after they had sinned, after that, they were triggered to fear. Their reaction was not to stand before God, not to own up to what was happening. Their choice was to fly, to run, to isolate, like a lot of us do so often. Now, here's kind of like what ends up happening in our world, and this is kind of a pet peeve for me. This is kind of something that it's just an observation I had. And for those of you that are like intellectuals, like, you know, maybe your spouse says, can't you just enjoy this? You know, stop overthinking this TV show. It's not real. I tend to overthink. And I have an issue with sitcoms. You guys know what a sitcom is? It's not a drama. It's not like a cop show or like a hospital show. It's the kind of thing where you've got like a circle, this group, and usually there's like a main character. And they often have like the laugh tracks and the applause tracks. Like Family Matters, right? Every time Steve Urkel walked in the house, everybody cheered. The live studio audience or the laugh track. Sitcoms are like 30 minutes, 22 if you put the commercials in there, that kind of thing. And it's like a group of people. So you got The Office, you've got Seinfeld, you got Friends, of course. You've got, Blackish over there. You've got a lot of great Cheers at the bottom, that kind of thing. I think this is Leave It to Beaver. If anybody's grandparents are here and wants to tell us what Leave It to Beaver was and why it was okay to call a kid that back then, right? But sitcoms are typically around one idea. If you want to be a writer for sitcoms, here's what you do. In the first 5 minutes, someone will make a mistake. It's usually a husband or a wife, or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and they will break a lamp, they will forget to book a reservation, they will make a mistake that they were supposed to do something different. And the rest of the show is them hiding that mistake from the person they care about. And there's all these interactions. They always come up with like a scheme, right? You know what I'm talking about? They come up with a scheme like, oh, we'll make it right. We'll make it better than it was. Oh, don't tell them. Why should I not tell this person I made this mistake? Because they'll be so sad. It'll hurt them so much. And then what happens at the end? I'm ruining every sitcom for you. Every sitcom. At the very end, the person finds out. They start playing the piano music, the serious, like, music. Why didn't you tell me? And they say, I don't want to hurt you. The audience goes, what? What do they say? Aww. And then the credits start to roll, and the other person says, like, just be honest with me. I'll be honest with you from now on. And then everyone's happy. Can I just be on that? In real life, that goes way different. So you lied to me for a whole week about this little thing, about this right here? Oftentimes what happens when we're in fear and shame spirals is we do things to cause division we cause division between people we love instead of bringing the truth into reality. Instead of just being honest, right? Observation number 3, and here's where I want to close today. God responds. And you can read on there, God responds after those verses that we read. And there's 3 ways God responds. First of all, God punishes the serpent. You know, the one that caused the sin, the one that caused the doubt. That there's punishment there. But God also punishes them. He doesn't let them off the hook. He wants them to learn. He wants them to grow. That there is a consequence for their mistakes. But here's the third thing God does. God protects them. Did you notice that? In verse 10, or it was actually in verse 8, God provided clothes for them. They provided themselves loincloths, but God actually gave them clothing. That what often happens is we are so afraid of bringing the truth into the light that we will live in fear the rest of our lives. But our fear of God's rebuke is often used just to keep God away. And that's why church attendance is down. That's why there is difficulty to have deep relationships today. Because it's so much easier to live in fear and in darkness. And you know what? I'll just stick the part of me that I want you to see out in the light. Or you know what I'll do? I'll just describe the person that I want you to think I am in the darkness. But if the lights are turned on, you have to see who I really am. You have to see the way that I really, truly am. I think that there are a lot of ways that we can live, but I would encourage us to live in freedom. And here's the way that we do that. First of all, we have to be okay with this question. And we're going to put it up on the screen. And this is what we're going to, this week 1, just really look back on. Do you want God to find you? Maybe you didn't expect that question. Maybe you expected the question of, do you want to live in freedom? Do you want to have this, or do you want to have that? Before we could ever leave the darkness in our lives, we have to want God to find us. And that's a level of trust. I don't know if you've ever played hide and go seek with a 4-year-old before, but I have. And it's way different than playing with anybody else. Because usually when you play hide and go seek, what ends up happening is you count, everyone goes and hide, and then you have to go find them. And if they're good, they're quiet, they find spots that are unique. But if you've ever played hide and go seek with a 4-year-old, you will count, and then you look up, they haven't hid yet, right? And you're like, all right, go hide. And then they finally hide. And you say, ready or not, here I come. And when you come out, you can be walking around kind of playing, and then you start hearing that voice. I'm over here. I'm over here. God wants to be found. Do we want to be found? And there's a lot of worry we can have about if God finds me, if I bring out into the light the things that I don't love about my life, if I sound whiny, or if I sound mournful, or if I'm angry, can God handle that? God can handle that. The God who made this world can handle that. My wife has been a dietitian for a while. She's got her own private practice now. She worked in a hospital before that. And then before that, she was working in a clinic, a dialysis clinic. And I'm not going to share anything. She's never shared information personally about any clients. But there's one frustration, like a general frustration that she brought up a lot. And that was this. She would meet with someone who has diabetes. And she's talking about the way that they need to change their diet. Some of them pretty major things. And she would say to them, here's the way it looks. And I'm kind of imagining her standing there with a clipboard and stuff like that. But she'd say to them, if you don't make these changes, you will lose your leg. And the person is just like, I don't want to lose my leg. I'll do anything. But a month later, 2 months later, they're going in for surgery to lose their leg. And she said that happens more times than I ever, it was the thing that was just breaking her. And so it always starts at the very beginning with not, what is the life I want? But is the first step to living a life in freedom something that I want? Not so much benefits of if I make all these decisions and I make these choices, but do I really want God to find me? Do I really want to make some uncomfortable changes? Because let's be honest, if you're in a dark room and you're kind of poking around for your keys or the light switch and it's just dark and you turn those lights on, it's pretty uncomfortable on your eyes. But it's better than walking around in the dark. So let's put some music on. Let's put that question up on the screen. And let's just take some time to reflect. Do you want God to find you? And if the answer is yes, I'd encourage you to write that on your Connect card. I'd love to pray with you. But this is the first step in this series, this Fear Not series. The first step is, do I want God to find me? Because we can go Oprah mode and self-help mode, and we can just talk about like top 10 ways to face your fears. And we can even get into like certain fears, and we're going to do this. But the doorway, the first step, is my heart and my life moldable enough to want to be found by God? If my life was a house, would I let God in and say, you can sit in here because I cleaned this room, but I don't want you to see the room that I stored all the stuff. I don't want you to see the closet that I hide things in. I don't want you to see what I do when no one else is around. I don't want you to hear the thoughts that I have about you or about people. So I'm going to stop talking. Praise God. And I want you to reflect on this question. I encourage you to close your eyes, to silence your phone and babies if you can. Just reflect on that. Do you want God to find you?